participatory budgeting. That's on JAM's YouTube page for anyone who wants to look it up. Today, we're going to be continuing the discussions on how we can improve accountability in governance in Jamaica. Now, mechanisms through which government can be held to account are critical in a constitutional democracy like Jamaica. Accountability is an important aspect of good governance. It allows citizens to understand why their leaders make certain decisions. It provides means by which certain problems can be addressed, such as corruption, for instance, and malfeasance. And it helps to improve the relationship between the government and the people by strengthening the legitimacy of the state and increasing levels of trust. Now, this is critical when one considers, for instance, the 2017 Gleaner Bill Johnson poll, in which 88% of respondents said they did not trust politicians. And in 2019, the LAPOP, and that's formerly the Latin American Public Opinion Project survey, showed that trust in local government was 39.6%, about 4 out of 10 people. One of the lowest levels in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2016-2017, only 22.5% of respondents, less than 1 in 4, said they trusted political parties. And voter turnout in general elections has been falling steadily, with the 2016 and 2020 general elections recording the lowest ever levels of turnout at 48.37% and 37.85% respectively. Now, these concerning indicators point to an urgent need to re-engage citizens by examining and implementing mechanisms that can increase trust and strengthen participation in governance. So this Twitter space is focused on discussing the possibilities of 2 of those mechanisms, recall and impeachment provisions in Jamaican law. And joining us to discuss the issue this evening are the Honorable Marlene Malahoo Fort, Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. I do want to say off the bat that the Honorable Minister has very little time with us. We do want to thank her because she made time out of her busy schedule, although we contacted her, just a couple of days ago to make time to talk to us. We'll be joined, Michael Phillips is the MP for Northwest Manchester. Donna Parchment Brown is a former political ombudsman. Ambassador Curtis Ward is an attorney at law, and Jeanette Calder is the executive director of the Jamaica Accountability Meetup portal, JAMP. So today is all about questions, it's all about comments and discussions and not presentations. We are going to be opening the floor to questions, so please feel free to share your comments. So far, I've seen a couple of people indicate that they want to speak, and we'll be doing that throughout. Please feel free to share your comments, as I said, using the hashtag JAMPForum and hashtag recall and impeach. And throughout the discussion, I'll be opening the floor to those questions. You can also share your comments as you go along by tweeting me directly at Archibald Keane, that's Keane, and that's ARCHIBALD KEANE, as well as at JAMP, JMP_Jamaica itself. Now, to set the stage for the discussion, why are we doing this? I'm going to invite Jeanette Calder to make some brief opening comments before we proceed to the discussion. Jeanette? Jeanette, I think you're muted.
Thank you, Archie. That was helpful. I want to just add a warm word of welcome to everybody, not just to this Twitter live and the conversation, but to a new year. I was just saying that I have a lot of great expectations for myself individually, for JAMP, but certainly for the government, the parliament, and the nation. And so I just want to extend, a very rich and rewarding year to everybody here. This is the 7th in a wonderful series that we have been having since last year, looking at constitutional reform that was really triggered by the discussion around the Republic. I don't know a tremendous much about the Constitution, but I knew enough to know that this document is far more important than we have been led to believe. And so JAMP is not afraid to go into areas where we don't necessarily have the expertise. What we do is create an environment for those with the expertise to come and unpack it for us and for other citizens. So I really want to thank all the panelists, Mrs. Parchment, Ambassador Ward, Michael Phillips, not just as a member of parliament, but as a very important chairman of one of our chief oversight committees, the PAAC. And I'm really grateful for the minister because she was with us for our first and could easily have said, Jamp, I've given you some time, I can't make it today. But she has followed through on the fact that she says she wants to hear from the citizens and she wants to share her thoughts as much as possible as we go into this year of constitutional reform. So it's going to be an exciting year. And I believe the discussion today is going to be a reflection of that. As I said to someone on Twitter a while ago, who didn't seem impressive about this discussion, I said, come on, come tell us why you're not. This is a family meeting. This is one family, Jamaicans, and we're here as families are to argue, disagree, agree, learn, share. All we ask, and Archie will again reinforce that, is that we just treat each other with love and respect. So thanks again for coming. And if there are any questions that we don't address today, please feel free to tweet, direct message, or send an email to Jamp. Archie, thank you again for moderating today, and over back to you.
Thank you, Jeanette. So I'm going to start by just having someone set the stage for us. And in this sort of context, I'm going to be inviting Mrs. Parchment Brown there, because in your former capacity as political ombudsman, one of the things that you stressed was this idea of the relationship between sort of government and citizens, and about why these accountability mechanisms are. So can you start us off by sort of setting the stage for that, for the discussion in that kind of context?
Thank you so much, Archie. Good evening, everybody. Congratulations on creating a space in which we Jamaicans and friends of Jamaica can talk about the issues that are important to our lives. Accountability is really something that we have been working on and struggling with. And I think one of the challenges we face on this matter of impeachment and recall is that it's sometimes heard as an attack upon those who put themselves up for political office. But I'd like to view it from another perspective. It's an opportunity for those who stand for political office to hold their own colleagues to account and to also hold their trust with the Jamaican people. I had the opportunity to review last year the proposed amendment to the Constitution to introduce impeachment, which had been discussed and recommendations made at a constitutional committee some time ago. And I do have a few thoughts about it, one of which is it's very important that the process is not owned by political actors, but is owned by representatives of the citizens who are not necessarily elected officials, but who can be neutral and can be trusted to act properly, because we don't want this to be a politicized thing, although it's in politics. So I don't know if that's enough for a start, Archie. I can go on if you like.
No, man, that's quite cool. Let's move on to the question of the recall itself, because we do want to have the discussion. So I want to talk first about what we mean by well overall, and perhaps here I can invite to just sort of clarify for us, Ambassador Ward, given your own experience, what we typically mean by recall, how that mechanism works in Jamaica and elsewhere. Would work.
Thank you very much for that. Because it has been on my mind, primarily because the electoral system, the entire structure is so different and within the United States compared to in Jamaica. Because in the US, any registered voter in the constituency or district, as we like to say, or division of the elected official can start a petition. And under the laws of each jurisdiction, there are thresholds in terms of how many signatures that have to be double checked to be valid against the voters' registration list. And once they meet that threshold, then it is usually put into the system for a recall vote. Now, in that recall vote, the person you're trying to recall is also able to run within that system, and if they get more votes than the recall petition, they remain in power. The system is very different in Jamaica. One of the questions I would have, how would you recall somebody who represents a garrison community or constituency? How would you be able to generate enough opposition to remove such a person from office? So I don't see recall working in that respect. I also would see the whole issue of the party political split, that any recall petition in Jamaica would most likely be initiated by the party who does not hold that particular seat, which is natural, and it could be seen as a political tool to rehash the election all over again, unless there are some other parameters and so on. But it's going to be extremely difficult to implement a recall process in Jamaica. And I know people, I certainly would like to see it possible. I certainly would like to see it happen. But the system is structured in such a way that unless you can now generate more votes for recalling somebody than that individual received during the election campaign, it's going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible.
Thank you. To be clear, this is a process that allows the electorate to remove an elected official before the end of their term. So it's sort of a special usually by means of a special election petition triggered by procedures laid down in law, and starting very often with a petition, a certain percentage of voters required, or signatures of voters agreeing to the recall. This dates back to the Roman Republic, where citizens could recall tribunes.
Right.
I want just to have we have the minister back. Sorry, go ahead.
If I may just add, if the recall petition wins, then there has to be a new election. And that does not, again, prevent the individual from running in the new election.
So you're sort of saying in that kind of context, what's the point of that kind of process? But let me just bring in Marley.
But it does work. It does work. But many times, the person being recalled wins in the recall election itself, and don't have to have a new election.
All right. So you raised a couple of different issues with regard to the pros and cons. Let me just bring in quickly Mrs. Malahou-Fort, because she doesn't have a lot of time with us, to ask her whether she thinks it's a mechanism that could work in Jamaica.
I don't know if you're hearing me, Archibald. I've been experiencing connectivity issues. I missed most of what was said, including it kept on going in and out. Are you hearing me?
Hearing you very clearly. We're just asking at this beginning, we're just starting to set the sort of context for the recall election. And the first thing I'm saying is, how would such a mechanism work in Jamaica?
I think I should like to start by saying, if recall and impeachment are aimed at achieving greater accountability, or we're looking for a process by which we can hold our elected representative to greater accountability, then hardly anyone would disagree. My research around current models of recall and impeachment make it a little difficult within the Jamaican context for more reasons than one. Unless and until we clarify what is the role of the member of parliament, the elected member of parliament or the elected councillor, in a better way than we understand it now, and until issues around the delivery of service. So the expectations on the office of member of parliament those expectations are far removed from what the true role of the MP should be. But in a context where so many institutions are not functioning well, and the member of parliament is seen as the first point of contact with government, the expectations are that you should be able to deliver to a constituent or a group of constituents just about everything for which government has responsibility and more, even those things for which the individual has responsibility. So I think although on one level we all want greater accountability for our elected representatives, I think the work, there are other things that need to be done around the role and the expectation and the resources of these office holders to get to the end process that you would like. I know the issue is topical, and I hear the call. I know that manifestos in the past have made promises, but the closer we get to realigning the society and bringing better governance, is the more we're realizing that there is so much work that needs to be done to clarify things. I think I heard Ambassador Ward speaking around a model which would require signing of petitions. He raised questions about how would you get it in a garrison constituency when almost the overwhelming majority of constituents vote in one direction and one direction only. Those are real issues in the Jamaican context. But I think also of critical consideration is the fact that there is a felt and lived experience for sitting members of parliament around expectations. And when you do not deliver in accordance with sometimes very destructive partisan expectations, then you are the worst person.
I'd love to bring in Mikhail Phillips here. I also, sent a request to him. If you're not seeing that request to be a speaker, can you log in and just log back out? You should see that request. But I hear you, Minister, speaking to a number of different issues, some of them raised by Ambassador Ward before, and I want to go through them perhaps one time. One, to do with the question of how the petitions and that process would work, because if you're talking about a process that involves the use of petitions, then you're also talking about verifying those petitions, ensuring that those people actually exist, that they sign the petition, etc. The question I have here, and perhaps I can ask Jeanette Calder to comment on this, is are we confident that we have that kind of capacity to do that? And Minister, you can jump in as well.
Well, one of the reasons that I would have been more encouraged than discouraged has to do with existing legislation. I have always spoken well of how Jamaica makes policy and legislation, the process it goes through, and the minds that are put to it. Currently, we have a local governance act that sets out at Section 18 that, and it actually, to my surprise, uses the word impeached. It speaks to the impeachment of a mayor of a city municipality. Now, this legislation is dated less than 10 years ago. So I am imagining, I came to the discussion, I have to admit, with an assumption that those who know more than I do, largely our legislators, had already gone through the process of, is this doable? In order to be able to say, and I'll just quickly say here that the circumstances referred to in this act speaks to, again, a petition signed by 25% of the electors registered to vote at a polling decision within the area of jurisdiction for that municipality, and a motion approved by 2/3 of the members of that council, alleging, and it's very general, alleging a charge of 1, gross misconduct, or dereliction of duty, if that's submitted to the minister. And of course, it goes on to the House of Parliament, the Houses of Parliament having to make a decision as to whether or not the mayor shall cease to hold office. So I am going to stand on the basis of this having already been thought out and a kind of similar general approach being taken that, yes, we can do the same, not limiting it just to a mayor, but extending it to a house higher than the mayor. I don't think we can have a lower standard for our parliament.
So if you don't mind my jumping in, no, it's quite interesting that we've done constitutional reform to entrench local government in the constitution, and yet the way we practice it is that central government has responsibility for local government, notwithstanding there are separate elections, and that people who serve as councillors are elected in their own elections separately from those who serve in central government. The more I look at the system, is the more I believe it needs to be rethought, if you ask me. And another question that arises, though not directly related to, I mean, not direct on the topic, but somewhat related, is whether we really can have how the coexistence of these two levels of government impact integrity in government and the delivery of service to the people. I know many would not wish to even open the can to look at these issues because there's so much sentiment around the local government, the central government issue. But let's ask ourselves, if local representatives are elected separately from central government representative, should the central government be overseeing local government? And since the issues that are intended for local government are so proximate to the people, is it the best way of governance? These are questions that the jury is out for me on.
Let me just bring in Michael Phillips here because I understand the point you made, and that was a point you made earlier as well in relation to the expectations are sort of presented to politicians, but the question of whether you actually have the resources to be able to do that, that's one issue. So the petitions is one, but also the question of holding people accountable without the lack of a job description, but also without the actual resources. Michael Phillips, your say on this question of whether recall could work. You're muted.
Are you hearing me now?
Hearing you clearly.
Yes. I was saying that we need to look at what the parliamentary structure that we have here, the size of our parliament, the size of our electorals, those who vote for us nationally. Look at the size of the constituencies and the size of the voters within those constituencies. Ambassador Ward made a point on how it is that you treat with those constituencies that generally vote one way or another. But you have to also look at the context of the resources that members of parliament get, members of parliament being blamed for things that actually the state ought to be doing. And until we get to the point of a more mature in our political process, and for ministries, agents, and departments actually serving the people as they ought to do, then I think that the whole issue of recall may be a difficult one right now, and I think it has to be properly thought out. Otherwise, what you may end up doing is having someone being elected, and then in a short while you see him or her being removed. An attempt is made in trying to get that person removed because one political party has a better organization in there more than other, and then what you end up having now is that political tension being built. So, we want to hold members of parliament, those elected representatives, accountable. I think that we have to look, because it's not one size that will fit all. I think that models that have been used in other countries, and some of these countries don't have the political, the electoral, parliamentary standing like we do, and the size of the parliament, that it makes it much easier in a democracy like the USA and others that don't have the Westminster system like we do. So, but it is something that what we have to really look at is look at the mechanisms that we can use in a democracy like ours that can hold our elected representatives, both at the local and the general, how we can hold them accountable. But I think we also need to carry the conversation on how it is that we can make government more efficient in serving the people. Because as Marlene said earlier, for a member of parliament to be be carried over the coal. And in my instance, let us use the Troy Bridge. That residents believe that I do have the resources to replace that bridge, when it is actually the National Works Agency and central government and the resources that members of parliament do get to actually. So the matter of recall is something that has to be well thought out, and other options looking at how it is that we hold elected representatives accountable is where I would go and end right now.
Understand where you're going. So the question of accountability overall, a question I have is is there a sort of legitimate concern that it will make people feel better? I thought really rather the opposite, worse about politics.
Well, actually, if I may come in,
Sure.
with the low and declining voter turnout in elections, it is good that we're looking at constitutional reform, and we're also raising again the issue of the duties of the parliamentarian. I think, with the CDF and other things like that, which suggest that parliamentarians should engage their constituents on a regular basis. I think just this lack of adequate engagement of the entire electorate within a constituency or a division. Also, I want to flag that point that Minister Malahoo Fort made regarding the central government having authority over local government, where an individual who happens to be a minister is able to potentially make very important decisions touching and concerning a whole set of people in a parish. So I think right now, not so much recall, I'm not done as much work on recall, but on impeachment, I think some of the same issues arise. And if I could just take a moment on that to say, there are ways in which we can build safeguards into the process to reduce the politicization of, and to also educate the public, because I think it's very important that we engage and educate both by hearing from and responding to what the citizens are concerned about. So, for example, the impeachment bill provides that the report gets made to the clerk to the Houses of Parliament, then it goes to a committee of the House in which the member complained against sits. And then that committee can make certain decisions. I think the committee should immediately refer to the impeachment tribunal without, making any comment on it. Simply gather the material and send to the impeachment tribunal, which is made up of people who are not politicians necessarily, although there's a representative of the prime minister and of the leader of the opposition proposed, but three other members who include two judges, and these five people to be appointed by the governor general. So in that space, you move away from political actors leading. And in my opinion, which I had conveyed earlier, the political ombudsman, if that office still exists, would have been an appropriate convener of the impeachment tribunal so that that work could go forward quickly with the governor general.
Sure.
But all of that, yes.
Right. A lot of things are being said, and I am amazed at how much I have learned since stepping into the political arena, having spent all of my prior life in government, different levels. There are some harsh realities that I don't know if we have spent the time to deep dive on and properly assess before conclusions are drawn. So this notion that the majority of parliament do not engage their constituents at large, I don't know how far it holds true. What I do know, certainly from the MPs that I interact with, and primarily those who are in the House now on both sides, that for the most part, they take their work seriously. They have specified constituency days. The truth is that a large segment of our middle class have opted out of holding government to account on one breath, in one sense. So There are issues around security. We can buy into our gated communities. It doesn't matter so much. Everything is happening on somebody else's doorstep until it happens on mine. So the water supply is not good at distribution, but I put in my own tank. And once I get my tank filled, and if when the water runs out, I can refill it again and store it, I'm fine. Electricity supply, I put in my generator and it's okay. There are a host of issues where I think the middle class has just opted out on. And research backs up the point. And I think that the argument that there isn't engagement, I understand that there is frustration all over, but the whole purpose of democracy, only today I've had to yet again remind that a periodically and freely elected legislature is the foundation of democracy. And the extent of the decrying of the legislature and and parliamentarians is something that begins to bother me. No, I'm not saying that there are not genuine issues of concern, and I'm not saying the entire machinery of government has to be looked at. The political directorate is but a small part, critical part, and I maintain that until we clarify the roles, until we update processes and procedure, because justice is both substantial and procedural, we're not going to have the kind of solutions. In Jamaica, we have a knack for solving the wrong problem. And when we dash good sounding solutions and you do not get the results, I guarantee you there's a misdiagnosis of the problem. And then there is the question, which as a member of the elected class, I find increasingly I'm taking an interest in. How do we strike the balance between the unelected and the elected holding to account? I'm saying increasingly, I am finding that I'm becoming I'm more interested, and I always had a high level of interest in what appropriate balance needs to be struck so that we can work more harmoniously and cooperatively together instead of escalating what appears to be resentment of one class towards the other. Maybe resentment is a strong word, but you get my gist. There are serious issues of governance, and sometimes I think maybe not intentionally, but how we frame the issues result in the space becoming far too combative and people having to put up the defense. And that way we don't get to the real issues. I want to commend JAMP for its own voice. I know that through its request for information on the CF programs, it really has helped my team to ensure that we have the reports compiled, and it's not just to assist you in doing the work, because I do believe civil society has an important role to play, but also in responding to constituents and just keeping account. I really think that with our good intentions, we're going to have to find a space to kind of step back, all of us. And when I speak to myself first, to really look at the approach that we take and what else that we need to do to make real progress on these problems that have bedeviled us for such a long time.
Someone's been wanting to come in. Is that you, Janet?
Well, I'd love to actually. So you read my mind. I thank the minister for those comments, and as she reflected on the things that she has learned since the time she's been in the house, I am here reflecting as well on, this year makes it 10 years that I have been engaged formally in advocacy. I started in 2013, and for those who think I began in 2019, no, not quite. And one of the things, and I'm hoping that these comments would help to set the context as we move into the impeachment discussion, but one of the things that it took me a long time to get it sunk into my craw is the matter that there is an employer-employee relationship between us as citizens and our parliamentarians. That thing missed me for so long. But that is the reason why I think this conversation is so important, and despite the concerns as legitimate as they are, I think there's so much that we are going to more benefit from, and even the concerns that we've raised about the partisan and the way in which that this can become a political football, they are real. Other countries have surmounted them. This is not unique to this jurisdiction, but the benefits of accountability, I think, will far outweigh those. Now, let me just give a quick example as what it
Jeanette,
is.
I don't mean to, I will have to run first. There was one other point that I wanted to say, that it was interesting that you pointed to the provisions in the Local Governance Act. And at another time, perhaps the conversation could be a little more targeted around that, because we have
Sure.
had examples of recall at the local
Yes,
governance
that's true.
level.
That is true. That is true.
Right.
That is true.
I truly regret that. I will stay as long as I can. I've just asked to just see if I'm needed. But the
Yes.
conversation, however difficult it is to have, we have to find it within ourselves to have the conversation, particularly when we have different perspectives on the matter.
Absolutely. And I appreciate that interjection, Minister, and I hope you can stay as long, but we really appreciate the time you've had. We will be doing it, so we will certainly share the rest of it with you if you miss the rest.
But I want to move to the question of impeachment. Jeanette, do you have a quick point to make before we move on?
But yes, and Archie, because for the work that I do, this has really helped to strengthen, and I want the others listening to benefit from it. And I was saying, there is an employee-employer relationship between ourselves as citizens and those we actually have hired through an election mechanism. I will shorten it to say this and hopefully unpack it a little further. If it works in the private sector, if holding people to account works and drives performance and makes them able to meet their objectives and is better for everybody overall, I think that we have to find a way in the public sector for us as citizens to hold those who we have hired to account and finance the machinery of parliament and government to ensure that we get value. One way of doing it is accountability. So I think we should push through to see how we can get it done despite the concerns. And I'll unpack that a little bit further because there's some more needed to say on that.
No problem. Let's talk about the other accountability mechanism that we're discussing this evening, and that's the issue of the impeachment proceedings, which would be different from the recall proceedings. Can I invite Ambassador Ward back here in just to set the context of how an impeachment proceeding, what do we actually mean by impeachment, which is one of those processes that's very often misunderstood. Ambassador, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Impeachment is a process of finding somebody having done something under the laws which merits impeachment proceeding, impeachment being brought against it. It's like an indictment. Impeachment doesn't remove the person from office in the American system. It only indicts the person, and the trial takes place before the Senate. Impeachment brought by the House, the trial takes place before the Senate. It requires 2/3 of the Senate to find an individual guilty and to remove that individual from office. Now, I think in the discussion on recall, I know it's impeachment. I know we haven't resolved most of the issues surrounding recall. But the minister did raise the issue of accountability, which I think is most appropriate when we are dealing with impeachment. Do we impeach somebody for nonfeasance? If nonfeasance is a detriment to the population, do we impeach somebody for misfeasance or malfeasance? What standards are we going to set in law to bring impeachment proceedings? The other issue is, how do we prevent the majority party in the parliament from impeaching a member of the opposition for political purposes? It comes back to the issue with the garrison communities. How do you ensure in impeachment that there's integrity in the process and in the purpose? Who makes those initial recommendations? I think somebody said the recommendation should be made without any publicity as to the grounds for the recommendation. I may have misheard that. But then I worry about that also, because if an agency, say the Integrity Commission, recommends impeachment of an individual, you know, whether you make the information public or not, we know in Jamaica you are guilty by innuendo and rumors. And therefore, the person who is the target of the impeachment be found guilty by the public even before the investigation takes place within the impeachment proceeding itself, without their findings within the impeachment proceeding. And then political party affiliation jumps in to protect that individual. We've seen this happen. We've seen egregious acts by current members of parliament who have not been brought to account. And it is really a political decision by the leader of any party whose member has transgressed to discipline that individual. And if that cannot be done at the party level, I don't see, if a party has majority in the House, how you're going to be able to successfully bring an impeachment proceeding in the House. The moral construct doesn't seem to exist for that. So, you know, I want to see this in law. I want to see it. I want to see it structured in such a way that it has integrity, that it is non-partisan, and that the Jamaican people can hold their elected officials and others high in government, elected or appointed officials, accountable.
Yes.
We shouldn't have to resort every time to a court prosecution for this to be possible, because oftentimes that never goes forward with alacrity. So, you know, we're at a standstill right now, and I hope we can do better.
Well, before we move on, we just clarify quickly before other jump in that we're making the distinction, or we want to make the distinction between what happens elsewhere outside of Jamaica and the proposals that have been made in Jamaica. So generally speaking, you're talking about an exercise initiated by a legislative body like our own parliament, and a response to serious allegations of misconduct by a public official. And so in the US example, in the US instance, impeachment is a process in which essentially it's like an indictment in the lower house or their Congress, and then the trial on the articles of impeachment or the specific charges, if I were to use that term loosely, are then takes place in the Senate in the US. In the case of Jamaica, there's an impeachment bill that proposes a new chapter of the Jamaican Constitution under which parliamentarians could be punished for acts of malfeasance called impeachable offenses such as corruption or authority that render them unfit to hold public office or that bring their office into disrepute. But that entire question, for instance, of what's an impeachable offense is of moment here, because even in the US, where the impeachable offenses are high crimes and misdemeanor, treason and bribery, high crimes and misdemeanor really means has not necessarily been completely and utterly clarified. And so one of the things we need to discuss here first is what would people think should be an impeachable offense. Donna Parchment-Brown, you've been looking at the bill. Jeanette, you've been looking at some of the examples of how it works overseas. Jeanette first, and then Donna Parchment-Brown.
May I just ask for clarity, which bill are you speaking of? Because I think I may have missed that part of the discussion.
This is the bill proposed by Bruce Golding back in 2011 and then updated by Mark Golding in a motion.
I see.
Yes. So first, Jeanette, the examples of how it's worked overseas based on the research.
I took a look at 5. I looked at South Africa's 1996 constitution. And just taking away from what you said, they're generally pretty much, the impeachable offenses are generally the same. Violation of constitution, any serious misconduct, and inability to perform the functions of office. So whichever way in which it is expressed, it pretty much amounts to that. So South Africa in 1996, Nigeria in 1999, Kenya in 2010, India made an amendment to deal with impeachment in 2015, and of course, we've been using the United States. What stood out that I liked, aside from the fact that the impeachable offenses were the same, is that some, for example, Kenya, would put a limit on how long this process could go on. And I like that because we have seen it in the United States, how it can be dragged out, utilized by the opposition or vice versa. So I like the fact that there was a timeline, and I would love to see us consider that that's not now in the bill. And I also like the fact that there were in some, and I don't have a position on this, but I'm putting it out there, the question of appeal. That is something that's generally there in law. Most of them that I looked at didn't have it, but some did. And I just wanted to point out very briefly that that is something that Jamaica could consider. I'm going to leave it at that because of time.
Mrs. Mallow-Hufort, we still have you with us. And then Mikhail Phillips, how do you see that working in a Jamaica context? But I'm sorry, Dr. Parchment Brown and then Mrs. Mallow-Hufort.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think we do have similar proposed impeachable offenses under the bills that you mentioned. I think the most difficult one is something called egregious behavior that brings the person or the parliament into disrepute. That's a more difficult one to define, but I think the others, corruption, etc., always it's a matter of proof. And what I like is that it's not the way it's the proposal is not for what happens in the US, where the upper and the lower house have different roles to play. But the house in which the person is a member would be where the complaint is up. There are timelines proposed as well for the impeachment tribunal. And I think the impeachment tribunal is really a very good innovation in Jamaica's draft legislation, because it takes, once the matter is now grounded, it takes it out of the hands of the elected officials into a tribunal that's named by the Governor General. They have timelines in which to operate. The difficulty is when they make a report to the House from which it comes, there's a possibility that it could be dismissed. The recommendations could be dismissed. So I think when it goes back to the House of Parliament, they should not be able to dismiss the recommendations of the tribunal, although they may be able to do some modification. Bearing in mind that the penalties proposed are censure, removal, and also disqualification for serving in certain offices for a time or forever. So I do think that Jamaica's draft legislation, not yet debated, not yet discussed, very much nascent, seems to be trying to address some of these concerns, that it will be overly politicized, and also that there would be possibility of dragging out extended periods, and lack of clarity on what the acts are, which could give rise to impeachment.
So first measure would be the impeachable. First, the accused official must be found guilty of an impeachable offense. Right. And there are 4 types: corruption or misappropriation of public resources, neglect of duty, abuse of official authority, and abusing the privileges of Parliament. And then the bill specifies which persons can submit a complaint against an official. Any 3 members of Parliament could request an impeachment. Any 3 members of Parliament could request an impeachment. They would have to lodge a petition by 1,000 voters. Yeah. In addition, these designated public officials could also request impeachment. So it could be the Auditor General, the Contractor General, the Director of Public Prosecutions, the Director of Elections, the Public Defender, the Political Ombudsman, any member of Parliament's Integrity Commission, the Special Anti-Corruption Prosecutor, the Chairman of any Commission of Inquiry. And then you would have an impeachment step 2, an impeachment committee and articles of impeachment. Creating a new committee, the bill would create a new committee of Parliament, the Impeachment Committee, to consider all impeachment requests. Their core functions would be to review their complaints against accused officials and to determine whether sufficient case, prima facie case against them has been established. Now, before I move on, I read this section that talks about, the 1,000 people, any 3 members of Parliament, and I kind of wonder the practicality, especially in the context of the discussion we had about recall, of how the bill has been set out. May I get your comment on that, Mrs. Mallow-Hufort, and then Mikhail Phillips as well?
All right. I'm going to comment a little more generally. Sound legislation must rest on sound policy. I think the fact that so many questions remain unanswered says that the policy work supporting the legislation may need to be revisited. It is, while we aspire for international good and best practices, regard must always be had to local realities and peculiarities within your jurisdiction. If we do not do that, we will never be able to implement and enforce the law to get the results that we are seeking. So the jury is still out for me about the bill put forward. The other point I wish to make is that because I feel as strongly as I believe many who are on this platform do about accountability and probity in public office, and since the focus is on elected office, let's be reminded that democracy is still very messy and it will yield results that we are uncomfortable with, but there is yet to be found a better form of government. Now, in Jamaica, we have made huge forward steps to deal with the prestige around political parties as important institutions in our democracy. We have campaign finance law. We have moved for registration of political parties, and we even have provisions for state financing of campaigns and elections, so that those provisions have not yet been implemented. I think we probably need to focus attention on what happens within the political parties that are fielding candidates for elections, who in turn will occupy these important provisions. One of the things that I've always said, and which has come home to me more closely, is that we can't expect our campaign and political processes to be fraught with rascality, illegality, corruption, and then expect government to escape those issues. Because in a democracy, the government sits on the political party foundation. It is a political party that campaign for office with a manifesto, and that is why certain latitude is given to governments having campaigned on a platform and with a manifesto to implement certain things. So I think we can make even more forward strides in achieving the goals and making progress on the problem if we perhaps were to pay closer attention to the mechanisms for selection of candidates in the political party and how they are dealt with, just as a way of sequencing the steps to get there. And we need to again look on the policy that is informing the draft bill, with a view to ensuring that we understand the complexity of the issue. And we are not merely going to be passing legislation to say we have passed it, and then, like so many other pieces of legislation, we struggle with enforcing it and getting the benefits.
Mikhail
Those
Philip.
are my remarks for now.
Mikhail
And I
Philip.
will have to run. I will try to listen to Mikhail's
Well,
input,
yes,
but I will have to run after that.
I just want to say that to remind listeners and my dear colleague, King's Counsel, that the original impeachment bill was tabled by Bruce Golding in his tenure between 2007 and 11, and a amended version was tabled in May of 2021 by Mark Golding. One of the challenges that I have in the Parliament is that, and as Marlene would know, there's no bill, be it that it is tabled by her or any other minister, comes there as a perfect bill. That's why we go through the bills. We sometimes have committee meetings, or we have the debates, and it moves from the lower house to the upper house. So no bill is perfect, but the issue of job description, impeachment, having our own head of state, or campaign promises made by the Prime Minister. And when other members do table these bills, they generally sit on the order paper, they sit on the table of the House for a very, very long time without even a debate. And these are on both sides of the House that there ought to be job descriptions for members of parliament, an impeachment bill, and having our own head of state. So, Marlene, when you made a comment a while ago to say that you have not read it and it is not perfect, it will not be perfect. But it is something that at least is a step in the direction that we want to see this put in place. And I would love to see that we have the maturity in the parliament that once an opposition member may table a motion or even a bill, that some consideration, even if it is for the government to say, look, we are not yet at this point, but it is a conversation that we're going to have, and let us now start putting things together, put a committee together to just look at the matter moving forward, because it's for the betterment of the parliament and the Jamaican people that we represent. The bill itself, and Donna mentioned it, Parchment Brown, that the impeachment tribunal for me is the inclusion of that gives me some comfort, because then it is not left up just to those of us as elected representatives to hear the matter, as would in the US, where you have the Senate hearing the matter, but you have persons from the judiciary. Even though one member of the committee would be named by the Prime Minister and one from the leader of the opposition, and then you have three other members, which two would come from the judiciary. But if you try to look at this section 96 M4, and it speaks of the house in which a person sits shall by resolution, which has received affirmative vote of a majority. So this is after the hearing. It sets out the process in section 96M, sets out in section what are the sanctions. 96MA speaks of the censure of the senator or member of parliament, be the removal of the member from the House or from office, or both, as the case may be, and the removal of the senator or member of parliament from the House. C, the disqualification of the senator or member of parliament from holding any public office he then currently holds, or any other office, the holder of which performs a public function. It speaks about the impeachment tribunal submitting its findings to the House within 60 days, and as a resolution, and sets out the recommended penalty. But 96M4 speaks, treats it. It speaks of that the house in which a person sits shall, by the resolution which has received the affirmative vote of a majority of all the members thereof, either affirm, modify, or dismiss. Now, if we're going to get the desired result, and it is not along party lines, then that section will have to be looked at, because I don't think that even as a parliament, as a country, we have matured, and we see it even in the US and other jurisdictions. When impeachment matters come, it goes straight along party lines. Even though we're looking at these extreme bills and resolutions in dealing with removal and impeachment, there's still a lot to look at in how it is we hold our elected representatives, our ministers, our departments, agencies, and those in government that have been given the trust of the people to perform the duties that they have been put there to. How is it that we, in the current structure, because I agree with Marlene, it's not one suit will fit all. How it is that we work within the structures of our of the democracy that we have here in structures of governance. How is it that we actually strengthen governance, strengthen government itself in doing the job that it is elected to or the persons who have been put in the position. But this impeachment bill is one that is very interesting reading. And I think it is something, because it has been sitting on the table for over a year, that at least it be looked at and a committee be put in place in looking at this bill and seeing how it is that we can shape it to fit our what we have here in Jamaica.
So this is the bill you're referring to, by the way, before I bring in Jeanette Calder here, is on JAM's website. It's also on Parliament's website if you want. There's also a summary or bill's simplified section that's on JAM's website. But I want to pick up on that question right there of that question of the mechanism, how it would work. Because
Archibald, excuse me, I must run.
Understood.
Thank you so much for having me in this space. I look forward to hearing the recording of the remainder of the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister.
Appreciate it much.
Yes, this question of whether this process would sort of increase and rather improve accountability overall. I want to go back to that because I asked it. It's a question I asked. I'm reflecting on where the recall discussion is concerned. But would that also be the case where impeachment proceedings are concerned? On one hand, it looks like a good process, but certainly when you look at the U.S. experience, you don't really. I don't find a lot of what I would say. Enthusiasm about that process or a lot of confidence in the process after seeing it unfold?
Well, I would say let us not just look at the United States of America, where there has been some difficulty, where you have one house voting for it and then the other house needing a 2/3 and not, so you have a halfway mark. Well, let's look at what has happened in some other countries, and two examples we know of is Brazil. We had a situation where the president was impeached in 2016 for what? What was the allegation against her? That she broke fiscal laws. Why? By manipulating the federal budget to make Brazil's true economic crisis, look less concerning than it was. Can that happen in Jamaica? Can that happen anywhere? As a citizen, I would like to know that if it's so good that we haven't had these problems, but if it were to happen, that there is a deterrent, because that individual would know the possibilities exist. And if it were to happen, that we could actually do something about it. But unlike the situation when it's not there, we are just left stuck, which I think is very problematic. We had in 2022, just last month, the president of Peru, his name is Pedro Castillo Terrones, was impeached. So there are examples out there that have demonstrated this is not something that happens often in Jamaica. And quite frankly, I think from our history, it would seem that we've done a good job of electing persons who are fairly mature and serious about the nation, that things haven't risen to this level. But I think that it is important that should we need it, it be there. Let me remind you that the minister said before she left that we have done this before. It is not presented at the local level as impeachment, though that's what the law calls it. But as I sat here and listened to all the concerns about how political we are and partisan, can anybody remember any of these fears materializing when we removed mayors? No, I think Jamaica has grown and matured, and we should put it to the test. Let me make this last comment, Archie. I don't know if it's clear to everybody listening. I had focused on impeachment a lot before I understood recall. And I think it was through interactions with Kenyatta Powell on Twitter that I really looked into recall and understood the difference. So let me say for those who are not clear, the recall, the simple argument is the people who put in the minister, the MP rather, should be the persons who should be able to take them out. Impeachment widens that, however, to a nation, any citizen, being able to remove a parliamentarian. My comment on this is, I am more in favor of recall, but I think the impeachment, but I think the country can consider both mechanisms. We don't need to choose for the simple reason that a parliamentarian in the House is not making decisions for his constituents alone. Policy and laws are national. Who is paying the MP? Not the constituents, it's the nation. So I think the argument of if we put him in, we should be the ones to take him out is an oversimplification. I don't believe the rest of the country should be left with somebody making laws and policy for us if the rest of us are uncomfortable. I don't think it should just be left to the constituents. So I really wanted to make that distinction and to share what our position would be.
Is that process, how would I say, can that process be sort of robust without the education of the of members of of the public, for instance, on two scores. One, from the perspective that there may be other mechanisms that could be used, but also from the sort of perspective of what are the actual expectations of vis-a-vis the realities on the ground. Donna
Well,
Patman Brown, your microphone is open, but Jeanette, go for it.
yeah, I'm gonna leave that to those who have a better sense of how we can improve the mechanism. My interest tonight predominantly was to sell the idea to other citizens that we need a mechanism. All I'm asking those who are listening is to consider you are employed, you are in a job. If when you signed that contract, the message, the terms and conditions say that after you sign the contract, nobody can fire you until the end of that contract. I'm asking you, we're all humans, but we're not very different. I'm asking you to consider how would your performance change? How optimal would it be if you have that security that once you sign that contract, you're good? The idea in 2022, after it was never even good enough in 1962, but the idea that we hire and we cover the salaries of employees, which is what they are, but we have to wait until election, could be 3 years later, before we can say we're not satisfied, we have lost confidence, is not good enough. We have to find a mechanism.
I want to support what Jeanette is saying and what I've heard others say, which is that the truth is this place belongs to us.
Absolutely.
Jamaica belongs to the so-called ordinary man and woman, and we periodically select, elect, and appoint persons to carry out specific functions, legislative functions, oversight functions, and representation functions in the case of parliamentarians for the most part. I think there's a way in which whenever you try to put a system in place, there's almost a panic reaction, as if to say, tomorrow, 63 people are going to be impeached. That's not what's going to happen. And even what is proposed in the legislation is very careful about who has the duty or the power to initiate such actions. And essentially, we're looking at parliamentarians with support of the public. And we're also looking at named institutions who are already a part of the integrity and governance architecture of the country, right? All these people are people who are operating under oaths, who are operating under appointments under the broad seal, and who are intended to be running fair and neutral entities that are there to be the eyes, ears, and voice of the public, the owners of the country. So I look forward to an opportunity for robust discussion about this entire thing where people have had a chance to read what is proposed and make other recommendations. We may end up somewhere else, but what I'm seeing already is that the efforts by the Constitutional Committee and others on the subject matter is one that says we're not trying to do something to kill off and hurt people. We're not trying to devalue the role and function of elected officials or other high officers. But we cannot as a country sit back and feel disempowered when there's conduct that is egregious or which specifically breaches certain things, where we can only rely on a political actor who has many different considerations to determine whether he or she will act in a situation. And that is why I personally believe that the impeachment tribunal should be convened by a named person. If there's no political ombudsman, somebody else who convenes it. So there's no delay. Once the complaint goes to the parliament, they don't need to find a prima facie case. They accept the complaint and they send it to the tribunal. And it's for the tribunal named by the Governor General, the head of state, or the president, whoever it may be at the time, to determine next steps within the timelines. And I really don't believe that the House that it goes back to should have the power to dismiss the recommendations. And they too should have timelines to act. But I'm not anticipating that every week we're going to be impeaching somebody.
Absolutely.
At all.
But it should be there in case.
Yes.
I wanna go back to that question of what sorry, Michael Phillips coming.
No, I just want to make it clear that, I mean, I said from the onset that I'm in support of the bill, and obviously the opposition is. It was It was tabled by the leader of the opposition in 2021. Um, it is looking at what are the desired results. What is it that you want to get out of it? And why I mentioned Section 96M, Donna, that section 4, in that it after the recommendation from the tribunal, it comes back to the House. If it is that it is going to be a simple majority, just repeating the concern that you have, then we will end up like other jurisdiction where you go through a whole process, resources are spent, and then you end up with that person who is being impeached, that there's no, at the end of the day, nothing happens.
Right.
And I think that section needs to be looked at properly. Hence why I said, the bill itself is not going to be perfect in the first draft, but it at least goes to a committee of the House to look at it and see how it is that we can strengthen it. What I like about the bill itself in section 96C2 is that it is not only members of the House that can bring impeachment proceedings, but Archibald went through the list: the Auditor General, the
Right.
Director of Investigation, Integrity Commission, Director of Public Prosecution, Directors of Elections. But it also speaks about that the petition itself needs 3 senators or 3 members of parliament, but
Right.
it also needs authenticated signatures from at least 1,000 electors.
Yes.
Yeah. So
I'm very proud of
it
the
also
effort so far.
brings into the mix the persons who have voted for. In my instance, I would want it to see more electors than just the 1,000. But the matter of recall, and it is something that the discussion, and I'm glad we are having the discussion on recall. But first, we have to know what is the job description of a member of parliament.
Agreed.
Yeah. How is it? What is it that we're going? What are the things that we're going to list out that they can be recalled on? If it is just for non-performance of a member of parliament because he has been elected and he's not performing, that I would say that is going to be something that is left out there too loosely for the political interference and removing someone that may not even get the resources. How it is that we fund government, that constituencies are properly funded, for not even through parliament, but the state agencies and departments are funded that they can respond to the people, the taxpayers of this country, and even those who don't pay taxes. How is it that they respond to the electorate and every Jamaican? That for me is a wider question on how it is that resources are spent, and something that we speak of loosely, but we have not had an overall conversation on how it is that government respond to the needs of the people. We can always say that there's never enough resources, but how it is that we respond with the resources that we have is a bigger issue that I think needs to be discussed at another time, and how it is that the state itself respond to the needs of the people, responding to how it is that we spend resources, be it in various constituencies, be it that it is represented by an opposition member or government member, how it is that members of parliament can make requests to agencies, departments, and ministries. Right now, we have to be lackeys sitting down at the door of our minister, hoping that we can get a pothole fixed or an inch of pipe or even water in a community. That for me is a greater issue in how it is that we perform as member of parliaments. When it comes to dealing with matters of corruption, and this impeachment bill is one that we should encourage the government to move forward on.
So if I may, the example that I'd let us look at is there are ministers who come from the parliament. So let us say a minister is supposed to build a housing complex at a particular place. It's been agreed, money is there, but the people carry out a protest. And the minister says, well, I'm not going to do the building for 1 year because you're too out of order. I would consider that to be both breach of your duty as well as egregious conduct that should, give rise to a potential impeachment. It could end up with just a censure.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, and I'm saying, the recall is the one that I would love to have that wider conversation about. As is now, what I would love to see the Parliament do is to see how best we can strengthen this impeachment bill, how we can strengthen it so that we can move forward in a debate and start debating the matter of impeachment. It is something that both parties have agreed on. Yeah, the Prime Minister himself spoke of bringing a bill to Parliament. It has been quite a while. The leader of the opposition has amended the one that was tabled by Bruce Golding. And so we both agree on it. And I'm saying that there are some low-hanging fruits that we have seen come to the Parliament that both sides have agreed on. And it may not be perfect, but at least just in a bill that is going to make amendments to the Constitution as this one, that a committee of both houses should be brought together, look at the bill, see how best we can strengthen it, and then let us start with the debates and bringing it forward.
So proceed
The time has come for us to bring something like this forward. It will help with accountability, both with parliamentarians and those who have been trusted to be ministers.
So proceed with the impeachment bill discussion, certainly, but hold off on the recall discussions at this point.
Have a
Well, have
wider
the discussions,
conversation
but not.
on the recall, yes.
Sir, Ambassador, you've been listening to all of this and sort of understanding a little bit more about this sort of Jamaican context and how the bill is laid out, in particular the impeachment bill, I should say, in the Jamaican context. Some of the concerns that you raised are, do you feel better about them, or are there still, lingering concerns?
Well, as Mr. Phillips said, these things need to be discussed more broadly, and the proposals that have been made to make them better. Nothing is going to be foolproof, mind you. But the Jamaican context is a very difficult one in which to operate as a politician who lack resources. I remember a politician saying to me once that he was afraid to visit his constituency because every time he goes, he has to have a pocket full of money to hand out because so many people come to him seeking help. Now, that should not be the responsibility of the MP. There are agencies of government that should be resourced sufficiently to carry out those responsibilities. But certainly in terms of accountability for the job that you're elected to do, nobody forces a politician to take a job, to run for office. Sometimes they don't realize what they're getting into until after they are elected. And that is true. And the points that Mr. Phillips are making are quite valid. But again, if we're talking about accountability, we must be talking about some form of malfeasance rather than non-feasance. And I think not being able to service the constituency, while it may be justification for recall, it certainly would not be justification for impeachment. But this conversation, to my mind, is just beginning. I very well do understand the Jamaican political landscape. As a Jamaican, I grew up in it and I follow it very closely. I know what the difficulties are. Some of them I don't know because I've never held political office in Jamaica. So I defer to those who are in political office. But this conversation, like I said, is still at the very beginning. There's a lot more to be discussed, a lot of clarification, a lot of strengthening of the processes and the structure to reach the point where this process will have integrity and people will buy into it.
We have about 10 minutes. We're closing discussions. I'm just going to go around the room right now and ask people for their final comments before we wrap up the discussion. Jeanette, your microphone is open.
Thank you. I just want to pick up from the revisiting the commitment. I agree with everybody who has said it kind of is necessary for the public to be clear if there's going to be a matter around performance as an allegation, as an impeachable offense, then the people need to know exactly what is the job of the MP. I, however, believe that that's not a difficult job. Since we've been doing JAMP, we've been looking at a lot of legislation and the work of the parliamentarians, and it's clearing so many different legislation. If we pull it together, it wouldn't take us long. So I don't want us to see this exercise as something that is pushing back our ability to treat with a matter that I just want to say was decided on by a joint commission, a joint select committee all the way back in 95 when both sides of the House looked at, discussed all the things that we're looking at today and said, no, Jamaica is ready. Let's go for it. That's 1995. So let's get that description of duties in place, which is going to serve us way beyond just the matter of an impeachment or a recall bill. Guys, we have a prime minister who will respond. Text him, email him, WhatsApp him, Instagram him, and let him know that this is something we need. The description of the duties so that we can have a real discussion about how we move forward with accountability, whether it be just impeachment and recall or generally increasing our understanding of what these very, very important jobs really are about.
Donna Parchment-Brown.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to have had the opportunity to hear the different voices in this conversation. From where I sit, the recall and impeachment ideals are grounded in a notion that democracy depends on good governance and the rule of law. That good people can be elected with good intentions, but get lost in a system that has not enough accountability, or that there can be accountability depending on things that are not transparent. And so to put in some more architecture that supports citizens knowing how when problems arise and they feel upset about something because it really is wrong, that there are mechanisms that can be used to help get the corrective action. And that those who take on that heavy mantle of being elected officials or named officials, representatives, that they understand that they are highly valued and that value has to be constantly reaffirmed by them by doing as much as they can the right thing and by knowing what the rules are when they fall into error or they do something that is wrong. This is not meant to attack or abuse people. It is meant to protect the island called Jamaica and the goods that belong to the Jamaican people. We have to move from a 37% voter turnout. And things like this, I think, will give people more confidence in the
Very true.
Jamaican state.
Very true.
Ambassador. Ambassador, you're muted.
Okay. No, I thought I had given my comments already to wrap up. But like I said earlier, the accountability is important. I agree, rule of law is the foundation of good governance, but accountability falls into that. And therefore, with accountability, we must have transparency. We must know exactly what the MPs are doing, what other elected officials are doing. We must know what the government is doing, what each agency is responsible for doing and not doing. Because everybody who is part of the government structure and in the opposition must be held accountable if they are not carrying out their responsibilities. And impeachment is one way of doing it. Recall maybe another, but Perhaps we're not ready for that. But I certainly support the idea of moving forward on this and working out the kinks and making it work.
And finally, Michael Phillips.
Well, I just want to thank Jam and the other co-hosts and speakers for at least having this conversation, a public conversation. Because when you look at it, many persons wouldn't have known that Bruce Golding had tabled a bill, as Janet mentioned, speaking about that committee of 1995, the whole thing of job description and looking at the process and processes of governance. But we have a responsibility as elected representatives, we have a responsibility of creating that trust between those that has elected us and roles as members of parliament, ministers, be it a head of department or agencies. But it's something that I've constantly spoken about, the committees of parliament, such as the one that I do chair, the PAAC, in how it is that we can bring those committees, that once we have a sitting of those committees and we unearth issues, or how it is that we strengthen governance, how it is that we can make sure that these recommendations or findings that are not just tabled in the House and in 9 out of 10 times are not debated and nothing happens. I made a recommendation that in other jurisdictions, the report is tabled in the House and the minister has to respond. And I think that will help us also if we could look, if the standing order is looked at, and if there's an interest in looking at it and seeing how we can, for good governance and for accountability, how we can use some of these committees and other avenues in strengthening governance. I am certainly not happy to see that there's only 34% of Jamaicans who have an interest in voting, and the less persons who has an interest in how it is that in governance overall of the country, then we are in a dark place, and we have to find a way in how it is that we build back that confidence with our citizens, not only those who vote, but how it is that we get everyone on board, every Jamaican on board, in ensuring that we save this country, Jamaica, land we love. We have grown up and gone a far way, but we still have further to go.
Thank you, and I want to thank not just you, but the other members of the panel this evening, the speakers this evening, the Honorable Marlene Malahou, Port Minister of Legal and Constitutional Affairs. She spent much more time than she had initially indicated, and we're very, very grateful that she was able to join us, because given that she had a lot of different kind of competing things doing at the same time, but she still made the time. I want to thank Michael Phillips, their MP for Northwest Manchester, Donna Parchment Brown, the former political ombudsman, Ambassador Curtis Ward, an attorney at law, and Jeanette Calder, who is the executive director of JAMP, the Jamaica Accountability Meter Portal. And just to point out that these discussions are going to be continuing. In fact, we have a third forum that's going to be coming up in a matter of weeks, and you can find out about that forum on all of the digital platforms. We'll be sharing on JAMP's Twitter page, that's JAMP_Jamaica. You'll also be sharing through our own, my own personal Twitter handle as well, that's at Archibald Keane. Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up, for sharing, for listening, for sharing your comments. I'm Archibald Gordon. Thank you again. You can follow me on Twitter at Archibald Keane. Thank you all, and good evening.
We just had a live broadcast of the Jamaica Accountability Portal, recall and impeachment of public officials. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the Make We Talk Jeffrey Tavares YouTube channel.